Okay, this begins History 1302, Unit 2. We'll have three big topics, as I told you before. You'll have the emergence of the United States as a world power. We'll have the Progressive Era, which has echoes remaining today. And we'll have World War I, which a good bit of that is more European than American history, but it has a large effect on the United States. It was just over 100 years ago. Okay, the emergence of the United States as a world power. We're accustomed to the United States being a world power. It's been one for my whole life. And for almost 50 years during the Cold War, there were two superpowers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union broke up in 1991 and pretty much disappeared off the radar scope, though they would like to make a comeback. China is the main threat now, and it is a threat. Don't take them lightly. But for the 19th century, Americans who thought about it would have said they would have been quite excited about what a great nation we would be and what a great role we would play in the world when we finally grew up. It was something that was sort of out there in the future to their thinking. And that in the last third or so of the 19th century, the United States surged ahead in terms of industrial strength. By the 1890s, we were absolutely an industrial power, but the hallmark of a world power in those days was imperialism, having imperial possessions somewhere outside their own homeland, and that's what the big boys were doing. So our leaders figured we better do that too if we want to be recognized as a world power. There was more to it than that, as we'll see. So I start with perspective. First of all, I'm not going to spend much time on this. And by the way, just watching these videos is not going to be enough. Just reading the supplements is not going to be enough either. They're meant to complement each other. So, first question, what factors in America's colonial past contributed to a desire to be free from involvement in European politics and wars? It seems that while we were part of the British Empire, especially from the last decade or so of the 1600s on up through our Revolution and beyond, every time Britain and France went to war, we went to war. That's because our neighbors to the north were the French settlers in what is now Quebec, which is part of Canada. It was a French possession at the time. We outnumbered them tremendously. We've got the 13 colonies combined would have had around 2.5 million people by the mid-18th century. The French no more than about 100,000. But there were four major nasty wars. The first three of which they started in Europe and we got dragged into them because every time the mother countries went to war, the colonists went to war. And that's a topic for 1301. But the American Revolution was not the first or even the second time Americans had gone off to war. Try the fifth. So people get tired of that. They get really tired of that. So one of the main things that provided impetus to the desire for independence was the desire just to steer our own course and not get sucked into European wars anymore. So that's part of it. Another thing there is that we would not have won the Revolutionary War without European assistance, mainly from France. So the American Revolution widened into a general European war, making it impossible for Britain to concentrate enough force here to achieve a military victory. I don't think they could have. I think that even if they won, they would have lost, but that's subject for 1301. So just not to have be tied to the apron strings of Europe anymore was a big deal. Okay, next, this is the third question already under perspective. What were the two main components of U.S. foreign policy until the late 19th century? One of them is a form of what's called isolationism. Now, that doesn't mean complete isolationism from Europe. We still had diplomatic relations. We certainly had commercial relations. What it meant, however, was that it was our policy to remain strictly neutral where the politics and wars of Europe were concerned. Um, we're just tired of that. We want to be out of it. We don't want to do that anymore. The Europeans helped us out quite a bit by running off a run of like 99 straight years where they did not have any big wars. There's some little ones. There's some internal uprisings. There's some colonial wars offshore. But the big old alliance versus alliance slugfest that used to take a decade or so in the 16 and 1700s, they didn't do that anymore. From the defeat of Napoleon, final defeat of Napoleon, it took more than once, in 1815 until World War I broke out in 1914, there were no big European wars. If there'd been one, it was we've never been able to stay out of one. They haven't had one now. There hasn't been one now for 75 years. And a colleague of mine tells me that a historian has already written a history of the Cold War, cold in that it's not a shooting war. And the title of the book was The Long Peace. We are now in the longest uninterrupted period of peace, as in absence of hostilities, among the major powers of the world that may have ever been. So maybe it's the balance of terror. So it was our policy to steer clear of all that. Now, the other part of our policy has to do with our relations with the Latin American countries. And that was embodied in a policy statement issued by President James Monroe on December 2nd, 1823. It's known as the Monroe Doctrine. And sparing you the background of that because that's 1301. This document proclaimed that we would oppose, and this is way back in the 1301 time frame, but it continued on way over more than 100 years. We would oppose any new colonization of the Western Hemisphere. This starting in 1823, era of colonization is over. The other thing we would oppose would be any attempt by European powers to regain former colonies that had become independent. For example, Mexico won its independence from Spain in 1821, and not that they necessarily needed it. We proclaimed that we would oppose that. How we would oppose it, hard to say. We scarcely had either an army or a navy, but it was the thought that counted, and this helped make us, in addition to the fact that we were the first colonial population ever to win their independence and make good, that made us the heroes and role models of colonial revolutionaries around the world for most of the 19th century until we up and switched sides at the end of that century. So, looking at my sheet here, so those are the two main components of our foreign policy. Now, what attitude did most Americans take toward the rest of the world in the 19th century? Okay. Well, it's hard to know which one was bigger, the ignorance or the apathy. Americans tended to know very little about the rest of the world and to care a great deal less. We're still not completely over that, though the world is now smaller because of better transportation and communication. But Europe is 3,000 miles away, and we didn't know much about it. We were safe here. Now, you just look at a map of the world, and you find another potential great power that's as favorably situated as we are. We have weak and generally friendly neighbors north and south. We have immense oceans east and west. Enemy tanks are not going to roll down Main Street. So our dangers would come from other directions, and they're coming now. What's going on now is dead serious. Do not underestimate it. These people are highly motivated and think they're doing right. If they get their way, we will lose just about everything that we value in this country, all for a pack of lies. Okay, so we didn't really know much about it. Now, there was at least one American Secretary of State in the mid-19th century who took a different attitude. His name was William H. Seward. He was Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson in the 1860s. In fact, Lincoln had beaten out Seward for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. And Seward was interested in gaining offshore possessions. In 1867, he worked 2 land deals. One of them fell through, the other one went through. For example, if you've ever heard of the U.S. Virgin Islands, Seward worked a deal where the United States would buy those 3 islands from Denmark in 1867. Congress couldn't see the sense of it and refused to appropriate the money. We did acquire those islands 50 years later. The other land deal, same year, we bought Alaska from Russia. A little bit of story on that. The Russian Tsar, the Russians had already fought the Brits once, a brief war back in 1855. The Tsar thought he was going to have to fight the Brits again. He didn't, as it turned out, but he didn't know that. And he figured that if he got into a more serious war with Britain, they would simply rip off Alaska, which was recognized as a Russian colonial possession. Not a lot of Russians there, but it was recognized as belonging to the Russians. The Brits, nothing he could do to stop that. They would snatch it up and lump it in with Canada. So the Tsar decided to liquidate Alaska, sell it to somebody while he still could. And he wanted to sell it to the one country Britain least wanted to get it, and that would be us. So the United States bought Alaska for $7.2 million. Now that'd be an immense amount in today's money, but that many dollars today would not replace our campus or anywhere close to it. So that land deal was pretty good, I think, and even though Congress joked about it, they call it Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox. Alaska did not become a state until 1959, I think. It's over twice the size of Texas and ranks 49th in population. I think only Wyoming has fewer. But I always thought the Cold War would have been way more interesting if we hadn't bought Alaska. You imagine about 50 Red Army infantry and armored divisions stationed up there, bomber bases, missile silos up there in Alaska. I think the Cold War would have been a whole lot more interesting. I'm glad that one went through. There was another Secretary of State a little bit later named James G. Blaine. He was actually a unsuccessful Republican presidential nominee in 1884. But in 1881, President James Garfield appointed him Secretary of State. Now, what he wanted to do, this is not imperialism, he wanted to get up an international organization involving the governments of all the Western Hemisphere countries. So he actually sent out invitations to all these other governments to send delegates to Washington, D.C. The problem was President Garfield was assassinated. It took him nearly 2 months to die. He was shot in the back while waiting for a train at a train station. That's before we figured out it might be a good idea to have some security personnel around that guy. He died of inexcusably poor medical care, even by the standards of that time. He's gone. The next president picked a new Secretary of State. It took several years to untangle all this, but the the convention finally met in Washington, D.C. in 1889. Early in the presidency of President Benjamin Harrison, and just in time for it to be hosted by James G. Blaine, who's back in again. Now, it didn't happen all at once, but that led to the formation of an organization that still exists. It's called the Organization of American States. So, that gives some perspective and background, and I'm going to put this in the can, so to speak, and maybe make another video tomorrow.